Hello and welcome to the Womb-Centered Healing Podcast. I'm Jessica Huckabee and I have Andrew Ecker with me here today. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrew, for the Ancestral Healing podcast series. I'd love for you to introduce yourself a little bit more and share about your journey with ancestral healing.
Oh, thank you. It's a real honor and privilege to be here to talk about a subject that's very dear to my heart. So I'm going to introduce myself here in the traditional language of my ancestors and then also the contemporary. So Dogate, She Inde, Andrew Ecker Yenishe, Donna E Nishinigi E Inde Nishe, Irish Bashachin, Inde Dashache, German Dashanali, Kote Go E Tishli E Portland, Oregon Inisha. Shema E Kathy Lindsay Woye Shaza E Dale Ecker Wole. So I am Andrew Ecker, my mother Kathy Lindsay, my father Dale Ecker. My mother's mother Elva Gallegos, Apache woman from New Mexico. My father's mother Evelyn Beatty, Irish woman from Pennsylvania. My mother's father Leroy Lindsay, Apache man from Arkansas. And my father's father Wayne Ecker, German from Pennsylvania. I have a daughter Bailey, a son Peyton, a fiance Monica. I was incarnated into this body in the land of the Multnomah in Portland, Oregon. Although I reside here in the land of the Akma Atam, the Peepash, and the Maricopa, here in Phoenix, Arizona. So I'm grateful to be here with everyone to talk about this very powerful issue and also journey that I feel is definitely at the forefront of our consciousness in this day and age, a day in which people are paying hundreds of dollars to have their DNA done, um, wondering about the idea and the concept of colonialism, wondering about how we become in relationship again with the earth. All of these things I feel are about this process of ancestral healing.
Beautiful. And from our conversation before, and just from my own experience with this way that you introduced yourself seems quite central to this process of ancestral healing, of acknowledging, the process of acknowledging our parentage, our ancestors. Every time we introduce ourselves, acknowledging the land where we're from, the ancestry of the land where we're at and where we were born. This all feels like very potent yet simple, a simple, basic way that is based on, that many cultures have had the tradition of introducing ourselves in that way that has been lost or disrupted in many cultures as well, to the detriment, to much detriment. And so I'd love for you to share a little bit more about that practice, and how that has developed for you.
Well, I'd like to offer it to you.
Okay.
So would you like to introduce yourself? Now, there's 9 principles of introduction here that I shared. So first is your name, then your mom, because we're going to go into a matriarchal system. So
Okay.
kind of unwinding, the patriarchy here as well.
Okay.
So we're going to go into you, your mom first, then your father, then your mom's mom, then your mother's father, going into that matriarchy, bringing forward the feminine first in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And then your father's or your mother's father, I'm sorry, and then your father's father. Then you're going to state, you can state where you were born, you can state where you live. And extra credit if you know the indigenous people of the land.
Okay. So I'll start. My name is Jessica Huckabee. My mother's name is Teresa Ingram now. She's had many names in her life. Her mother is
You could go that way if you'd like.
okay.
Generally, we introduce the father next.
Okay, so my father,
Yeah,
I have two. I have an adopted father, Michael Todd, and I have a biological father, Guy Hardy. Okay.
nice.
And
Now
so
your
then
mother's mother?
now my mother's mother is Rita Brown, and my mother's father now.
Father's mother.
Oh, my father's mother
Yeah,
is Helen Hurtado.
nice. Okay. And
And
now
that's
your
my
mother.
adopted father. I don't know the name of my biological father's mother, but we can actually, after our last conversation, I imagined what I asked her what she would like to be called. And I think what she told me was the Weeping Willow.
Grandma Weeping
Willow.
Willow.
Yes.
Beautiful. I love it.
Yes.
All right. It feels good.
And then, okay, so who else? Did I miss anyone?
Mother's father.
My mother's father is Jack Brown.
Beautiful. Where and do you have any do you know the connection they have to their lands or their lineage?
Yes,
Um,
my mother's mother is of Italian heritage, but born in California, Sacramento, California. And my um, mother's father is of mixed European heritage, going back quite far. I've traced it back to colonial times.
okay.
And then mixed European. And then my father's mother is of Mexican heritage, born in, well, I'm not sure where she was born, but she lived in Fresno, California. But that's my adopted father, and he was born actually in Tucson, Arizona. That I
Okay.
do know.
Nice.
And my biological father is of German and Native American heritage, both the Choctaw heritage, but that goes back a few generations.
For sure.
And
Yeah.
yes, and he lives, if he's still alive, I'm not sure if he's still alive, in Indiana. Bloomington, Indiana was his last known residence. So
And
there's
your final introduction would be your father's father.
my father's father. Okay, my adopted father's father. Goodness, I don't know his name, but is still, he's probably not still alive, but he was Mexican heritage and was in Sonora, Mexico. It's not coming to me right now, the name that he would like to be called. I'll have to follow up on that. And then my biological father's father as well, the name that I got from him when I inquired was the Strong Tree.
Mm,
Grandfather
beautiful.
Strong Tree. And
Beautiful.
I think him and his wife lived in California, in the Chico area.
Ah, nice.
Okay. So then
And
what the other thing is where I live, or where I was born and where I live.
yes, where you were born and where you live.
Okay. So I was born in Newport Beach, California, and I don't know the indigenous nation there. I currently live in Clear Lake, California, and it's the lands of the Pomo tribe.
Mm, beautiful.
And then my husband is Jeffrey Huckabee.
Ah, awesome. So little touch that I could share with you. Oftentimes when I introduce the feminine side of my family, I introduce their maiden names.
Okay.
Because I feel like, first of all, they were a person before they became a wife.
Yes.
And that feels right to me,
Mm.
being that I have the same sort of situation with name changes.
Mm.
So it feels like that's what they were incarnated in that name. So that's like, I feel like the essence of them in a certain sense. And then generally, I don't necessarily use a was in front of anybody, um, or an is. I just say their name. So I say my mother, Kathy Lindsay, my father, Dale Ecker,
Oh, gotcha.
and my grandmother, my mother's mother, Elva Gallegos. I don't necessarily put them into a time because the past tense, present tense, it tends to create a limitation in that relationship,
Mm,
which the practice for me of the ceremonial introduction is about connection. And I think that that's what, many earth-based kind of knowledge systems really looked at in this. So when you're introducing yourself in a setting, even as I introduced myself, there may have been some people that said, "Oh, well, my family's from Pennsylvania. My family's from Oregon. My family's from New Mexico." All of these ideas, and they may have resonated with a family member's name
mm,
that came forward. We have these connections that sometimes are overlooked in what the contemporary culture kind of mandates as far as introduction.
mm,
Generally, if we're at a meeting or a party or something like that, hi, my name is Andrew and I'm a drum circle facilitator, or hi, I'm an author, or I'm a speaker, or, all of these things that come up. And this is really a behavioral based model of self identity, and it doesn't really give us an allowance of connection to our ancestry. It doesn't really create those deeper bonds of intimacy. And the more that we work on these ideas of self-identity, and the more that we practice this in a community setting, we are unraveling these kind of systemic ideas of individual, what I would say is energetic architecture of self-identity. And it relates directly to our ancestral healing, because the culture knows, in a certain sense, and I don't know if this is some diabolical idea that this was planned out, but certain religious systems have this idea of severing ties to family, severing ties to ancestry, that there's this new way of looking at self. And this creates some, what I would say is a system of abandonment.
mm,
And when a person is abandoned from the nature of the foundation of their ancestry, the natural sort of causality is dysfunctional behavior.
mm,
It is very apparent in the system that is put upon us today that this is a destructive system. And it's, we point fingers at the family oftentimes, yet the families don't have the tools to even begin to create a foundation for the future generations. The system that I shared with you as far as ancestral introduction and earth-based introduction, this has been a part of communities since the dawn of cultural identity. This has been a way that people have introduced themselves. And thankfully, there are still many communities around the earth that still use this practice. I was, like many of the listeners, I would imagine, lived in a world where that was never a part of me. I never heard anybody introduce themselves like that until I was around my Native American relatives. Now, I grew up knowing I was Indian. I was Apache. My grandfather told me that. Basically from behind a bottle of whiskey. I came home from school one day. He was, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He had already been drinking. He was a Vietnam veteran, and really struggled a lot with PTSD. He was in Korea at 16 years old,
yeah,
the Korean conflict. They basically falsified the family Bible so that he could go in before he was 17. So if you could imagine a 16-year-old boy going into one of the worst wars in the history of the United States,
mm,
and then having to deal with that. He medicated himself and really struggled, but did his best, and he did his best to hand the knowledge that he had onto me. And one of those things was that I was a renegade Apache. I came home from school, and he told me that, and I didn't know what that meant. All I knew is that there were images on television, and also images in my home. My mother also struggled with addiction. And this is all a part of the generational trauma that follows many of us that, I guess, haven't really unraveled a lot of the consequences of colonialism, a lot of the consequences of the mission system, the hundreds of years of warfare that went on with the indigenous people that are here, the murders, the rapes, uh, the destruction of our culture, identity, all these things. They're all a part of that kind of passing of the baton of the destructive system that leads to a person that has no foundation of self identity. So when I probably need to rewind a little bit. I'm a professional musician and I also facilitate drum circles. And the drum circle for me was one of these kind of contemporary vehicles of ancestral wisdom. Now, I say that because a drum circle is not a traditional kind of thing. It's not a 10,000-year-old drumming practice, but it is a significant practice in the way that the drum has been used in many traditions. So, this emergent culture of people that are wanting to get connected with the earth, wanting to understand these kind of foundational practices of what I would say are more functional communities, communities that live in harmony with one another, harmony with the planet, have traditions that are set up. From the outside, looking at that as a person like myself that was dealing with generational trauma, generational drug addiction, alcoholism, incarceration, even, which is another topic I'll get to. When I seen the drum circle, it was like, what is this? Why is this? Why is this something that makes me feel something? And I felt something like rebellion. I felt something like wisdom. I felt safe. I felt held by the music. And this was, way back in 1994. I like to say, and on top of Mount Tabor in Southeast Portland, Oregon. It wasn't, on the reservation or, in some, jungle drinking ayahuasca or something like that. This was, just people with long hair and wearing, hemp necklaces and tie-dye t-shirts and dreadlocks that were playing music. And it was like people from all over the world. There were people that were playing African drums and a man from Puerto Rico that was playing congas and people dancing, and it was under the full moon. And it just felt right to me. And that sparked something in me. I was 18 years old. I just graduated high school, was involved in the drug trade. My parents, being that they both died of drug related causes, it was very easy for me to get involved in selling marijuana. I wasn't like some big time drug dealer, but I was, selling marijuana on the streets. And when I went to this drum circle, I went there with the intention of finding the community that had LSD and mushrooms because I wanted to trade some high grade marijuana that I got from Arizona to these people for LSD. And I basically had a shaved head. I wore, straight leg Levi's, Doc Martens, and, like white t-shirts. I mean, I was out of a Vadio in Phoenix called Suntown. And I knew nothing about this alternative kind of culture of long hair people. Like they were like something completely alien to me. But it felt right. It felt like, wow, this is medicine. And subsequently, for 20 plus years now, I've been involved in the drum circle community and have a very successful drum circle facilitation business. In 2019, prior to the pandemic, we facilitated 587 wellness-based programs. And this is, an evidence-based practice that we've developed over those 20 years that is utilized by major corporations and hospitals like Cancer Treatment Centers of America. And, we've done work for Charles Schwab and all kinds of major organizations, Bain Consulting, $4.3 billion consulting firm out of New York City. So, I mean, the list goes on, plus all the music festivals too. It's really an extensive amount of work. But the reason I mention that is because the drum led me to the Navajo Nation. And when I was invited to go to a healers conference, and this was decade ago now. I went there, and a man named Fillmore Bluehouse, he was or he is a medicine man. And he invited this group of people that were there for this healing conference. And this was a contemporary healing conference that was basically introducing some of the traditional healers on the Navajo Nation that work at a specific hospital, where this woman, Michelle Morgan, was a nurse. She kind of designed this whole thing. So it was an integration. And I had already been working in hospitals doing drum circles, contemporary drum circles. They invited me there to do one. And this man, Fillmore, before that we did the drum circle, he said, "Hey, I'm having a gathering at my Hogan, and I really would like some people to come. Would you like to come?" And I said, "Sure." So I remember I got there really early, because this is kind of what I was there for. I was seeking this kind of, elders' wisdom. And I got to the Hogan, and it was, cold. They started a fire. There was a young man, maybe like his apprentice, and he was sweeping the floor. And it was a dirt floor. And I remember the kind of smell of the dirt mixed with the smoke from the fire in the middle of the Hogan, and it being something that really calmed me. It was almost like an aroma, like an incense or something like that. And I remember sitting down and just feeling so comfortable, and really like I have arrived in a certain sense. There was a lot of feelings that went through me, being a person of Native American and European descent coming onto the reservation. There was all kinds of emotions that came forward for me, things that I was in process with. And I sat there, and I remember, groups of people kind of coming in. And by the time, it was ready to begin, the whole Hogan was packed with people. And there were elders that were there from the community. And when he began kind of his teachings, he said, "Is there anyone that would like to introduce themselves?" And there were a few elders that spoke up, and they introduced themselves just like I introduced myself to you, in the traditional language. And it was really something that sparked a question for me. I was like, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a child? What does it mean to be a grandchild? What does it mean to be from the earth? And that question led me to really diving into this idea of my own ancestral connection. Now, to say that from that moment to where I'm at with my introduction was a journey is really an understatement, because introducing my mom and introducing my dad, every time I do that, I'm remembering the humility that comes from being the child of two parents that suffered from drug addiction, that died in their addiction, that used me to steal, that left me at drug houses where I was sexually abused, physically abused. By the time I was in, the fifth grade, I had already been involved in multiple drug raids. And I'm a child of the Clinton Reagan era, which was not the, let's legalize marijuana, let's decriminalize, substances. This was the war on drugs. And communities were scared of people like my parents. They were completely fearful. And, subsequently, when the police came in and raided our house, it was violent. Guns were drawn on me and my sister. I have a relationship to depression. I have a relationship to suicidal ideation. I have a relationship to post-traumatic stress. All of these things are a part of my makeup. And, thankfully, using that ancestral introduction has given me an opportunity to really evaluate why. Why was it that I was raised in this environment? And I've come to a place of realizing, I feel many people that have been called to a path of purpose and service and relational spirituality, that there was maybe some point in my spirit's development where I said to the Creator, "Hey, Creator, I want to bring people together with the drum, and I want to teach people about self-identity." And the Creator said, "Well, I think a perfect assignment for you would be the child of two drug addicts. That's what we're going to make you." I think Wayne Dyer said, I want to empower people. And he said, the creator said to him, well, we're going to make you an orphan, you know? So I really resonate with that. I resonate with this idea. And I do believe that there is a level of, once you unravel the victim inside of you, you come to this place of empowerment. And I feel like embracing the victim is an important catalyst for this. Embracing the victim of generational and ancestral trauma and ancestral healing, all of these parts of us. Because on the other side of really feeling the pain of the victim is this clarity that comes into our lives, where we begin to understand that that's medicine. What I went through as a kid, being able to share in front of a group of people in a drum circle that I was sexually abused, or on a podcast, or in front of a crowd of people at a mental health conference, or any of those things that that my mom used me to steal as a kid, that I would end up using heroin with my father, that I was incarcerated on the same prison yard I visited my father at. All of these things have turned into the medicine of my life today. And inherently in that medicine, the inheritance of the trauma has been a really powerful understanding of ancestral healing. And I'm not talking about like, let's do a past life regression kind of stuff. I'm talking about real working through your relationship to your mom, your relationship to your dad, your relationship to your grandparents, to the land. Why was it that I was born in Portland, Oregon? One of the, we were the only people, that looked like us on our street. Everybody else looked like a hippie biker, where I grew up in Portland. It was like, and that sort of catalyst from being these, descendants of New Mexico Native Americans, where one uncle got a good job and then literally transplanted everybody. I lived on the same street as my great grandma, my great grandpa, my grandma, my grandpa, my aunt, my cousins, my aunts. We all lived like within 2 or 3 houses of each other. Very clannish family. Like we just stuck together. And it was always, kind of like us versus them in a certain sense. And that idea of sticking together has been a part of my development as well. These things all come into focus when you kind of let yourself like look at the bigger picture. And I think that for me, ancestral healing is about that. It's about that bigger picture of your life.
Mm-hmm. Wow, Andrew, thank you so much. You're such a brilliant storyteller. I'm just really drawn in to your story, and I really appreciate you sharing all of the wisdom and the medicine that is coming out of your experiences. And I'm curious about the drumming, and you talked about it being a evidence-based practice. And I know that in our previous conversation, a preparatory conversation, we talked a little bit about how, one of the big topics in ancestral healing circles is cultural appropriation, right? That people who are very disconnected from their own ancestral heritage are very tempted to and feel drawn into traditions that are more connected with their ancestral heritage, and end up being in a position, especially from European heritage, to repeat the harm of stealing other people's cultural heritage. And we talked about that a little bit in what you talked about with your drumming circle, and that how is it that where are the traditions, the source traditions of the drumming that you're offering and taking to all of these communities that you described, and how you navigate that. And you talked about it being an evidence-based tradition, and that it's not necessarily that you went and found a particular therapeutic drumming tradition from your Native American heritage, and that's not necessarily what you're sharing, but instead that through your contemporary musicianship and musical training, and this recognition of drumming being basically a universal cultural practice across the board, that through your experience of coming together in drumming circles and facilitating drumming circles, that it's become clear that there are certain ways that it becomes therapeutic for people. Could you talk a little bit more about
For
that,
sure, for
and how
sure.
you
So it's a
discovered that?
really interesting concept. So first of all, I think one of the ways that we can utilize, and also for all the listeners here, and I'm sure that this will be in the show notes, but I do offer my book for free. So I wrote a book on ceremonial introduction, which is the Sacred Seven. And get that book. It's a whole guide of a lot of the stories that I shared right now with you, but also some practices.
Mhm.
And the reason that I want to share this with everyone is because at the beginning of my drum circles, I utilize the techniques that are in my Sacred Seven book. And the Sacred Seven is, again, a window into an ancient, tribal, earth-based technology. This is a wisdom that was a part of European ancestry
Yeah.
all over Europe. In fact, even in places like Wisconsin and Minnesota, and if you talk to people that have lineages back to the Nordic kind of people, Vikings and such,
Mhm.
Norwegians, because I work a lot in retirement communities, so I've had this conversation with them, and it was very common in the United States to introduce yourself as I am the daughter of, I am the daughter, the granddaughter of, and born to. I mean, this was something that was a part of even early American identity in certain religious groups and certain communities. Like if you were at a dinner, a function, you would introduce yourself in a way, and that tied directly back to communities in Europe.
Mhm.
Now, where we got the disconnect in the European identity, and I can say when we got it because I'm European too, was during the landlord system, and this became a part of colonial ideas that there were only certain groups of people, elite people, that could have a name that was associated with the land.
Mhm.
Now, if you lived under that premise for thousands of years, literally, or at least, several hundred years of really being mandated to serve the landlord, when the Pope and when the hierarchy of the Anglican and the Church of England come out and they say, manifest destiny, you can be your own landlord in this new world. Go out and take the land. You're mandated by God to get a land ownership. You're living under this servitude
Mhm.
to the kings of the land, which I have friends that have names that are associated with land regions in Europe. And then I have friends that have association to job titles. You
Mhm.
get the knight, the carpenter, I don't know if you've ever researched
Oh
Huckabee, like
yeah,
what,
it was something to do with work that was done on the ships in the bay.
there
So
you go. So yeah, so
Huckabee probably, doing some physical labor with products that were shipped in the bay.
So this is another job related identity.
Yeah.
So these are people that come from servitude. They come from slavery, basically, in some way or another. This is where the first ledgers came, and one king would say, hey, I have 25 Huckabees, and I have 150 knights, and I have 125 singers. And all of these names were synonymous with jobs that they could borrow money against
Mm.
in their land region to wage war. And that's where it came from primarily, or, to do infrastructure changes or whatever. But primarily it was warfare. And one king would borrow money from another to go conquer more lands. And then you have this identity that's associated with servitude and an identity that's associated with land based identity. And when you have the formulation of manifest destiny, which is this idea that you could go out and be your own owner of land, people are like, what? How could I, a servant, born into a servant's name, ever own my own land.
Mm,
So when that concept came into the focus, of course, the people were going to go out and try to conquer and colonialize. And plus, it was a message of God. I
mm,
mean, literally, that's what these people were saying. They were saying, God told us that you could own land. And, that's where the hundreds of years of warfare that colonialism caused, I believe, kind of originated in. And this is due, my own history studies. I don't have any reference points to point that out, but I believe that the empowerment that many people faced was primarily back to a disconnect from the earth and their ancestral lineage.
mm,
And this is really important to the conversation of the drum, because when we unravel that and we begin to honor the indigenous people of the land, honor the indigenous traditions of the drum, and say to the group of people, this is what I say in the first 15 minutes. This is not a traditional experience with drumming. But what this is a connection through the drum to many traditions around the world.
mm,
In Cuba, it's called rumba. In Puerto Rico, bomba. In Egypt, hafla. In Hawaii, luau. In Guinea, West Africa, dundumbois. In Mexico, bamba. In Ireland, drama circal. In Italy, tarantara. In Belize, punta. In Israel, kumsitz. In us, the Native American people, sometimes we call it powwow. And this idea that these cultures around the world, the great continents of the world, all have a tradition. The land based identity of the people has a tradition for drumming, that drumming and singing songs and connecting with one another through dance is something that's synonymous not with one culture, but with all cultures. That we, as a practice, can begin to integrate a container that says, hey, if you are from African descent, you can play your African drum here. And if you're a European person, you can play your European drum here. Heck, you can play these contemporary drums that are just made in America that, don't really have an identity that's traditional. The drums we play are Remo drums. And these are made in Valencia, California. They're not traditional drums, but what it does is it gives us a window into the idea of what many earth-based communities have said about the drum. And the drum is not the heartbeat of Native American people. The drum is not the heartbeat of European people. It's not the heartbeat of African, Polynesian, Asian. It's the heartbeat of the planet. And we as earthlings, when we get connected with that heartbeat, we feel something.
mm,
And the majority of the time that people get connected with that heartbeat, they get connected with it in a traditional setting. They get connected with it in maybe, a Native American hand drum session, or a West African drum circle, or a drum session, or, a Latin drum session, something like that. And they feel like that's the only way that they can learn. And I've studied West African, I've studied Middle Eastern, I've studied Latin, I've studied Native American drumming. All of these forms of drumming are a part of my kind of lineage. And, I have teachers in those drumming arenas. All of them are important to how I navigate my relationship with the drum. And I want the listeners to know that regardless of where they were born, they can have a relationship with the drum, and the drum can help them. It can heal them. It can help them flourish in a very powerful way as an earthling, and also get connected with their ancestral knowledge. I know that if it wasn't for the drum, I know I wouldn't have been on Navajo, listening in that hogan, hearing the elders talk about their self identity. The drum led me to that, and the drum, the West African djembe, which I studied under Mama de Keita. I studied under, Dr. Sunkett here in Phoenix, Frank Thompson, all these great, West African traditional players. And the djembe brought me to wanting to learn more about my Native American heritage,
mm,
this West African drum, which is really remarkable. And recently I was able to gift a Native American hand drum to a man from Guinea in honor of that, saying thank you for bringing this drum here to help me and, my life and my family. And here's, a drum from our lineage. And that was a very powerful ceremony that we had in New Mexico not too long ago.
Mm.
But these ideas of saying, oh, because you were born in a colonial occupied land, that you as a person of European descent, the descendant of colonial people, are not, you can't have a relationship with the drum. For me, this is a part of the sickness.
Mm.
Because if we as indigenous people really believe that the drum is the heartbeat of the planet, how are we going to bring people back to the earth? If we are not able to connect to the vibration of the drum.
Mm.
I believe that we can bring people back to an earth-based knowledge system when we bring them back to the frequency of the heartbeat of the planet. Many people that have grown up in these colonially occupied lands are looking to Mars to colonize. They're looking to the moon to colonize. And it's like, hey, realize that there's still hope for our planet. There's still, we can still heal this planet. Spontaneous healing, we know that people have been healed from cancer spontaneously through prayer, through ceremony. Why can't we look at the earth and say, she can be healed spontaneously? She can be restored spontaneously. And I believe that that in itself is the disconnect from relational spirituality. Many people in the contemporary culture are still living in the idea of manifest destiny. They're still looking at the mountain and seeing a resort. They're looking at the river and seeing, a commodity. They're not really understanding that ththese are our relatives. You as an American person, learning the river of your ancestral heritage. I was born next to the Columbia, the Willamette River, the Clackamas River. I was born next to Mount Hood, Mount St. Helens. These are my mountains of my birth. Here in the Valley of the Sun, my land that I live in right now. All these mountains, I've hiked these mountains. I've introduced myself to these mountains. I've introduced myself to the rivers of this land. These are my relatives. And you, as a colonialized person, you can begin to deprogram that colonialism by understanding that the mountain is your relative. The ocean is your relative. And these lands have ancestral wisdom inherent in them. When you're at your PTA meeting, when you're at your 12-step meeting, when you're getting in front of a group of people at work, at the office, you say, I'd just like to pause here for a moment to acknowledge the earth. Let's all just feel the earth underneath us and know that these lands that we live on, the mountains around us have had prayers written on them, showing people where the water is, where the food is. Every mountain in this country practically has petroglyphs on it. There's some place on these mountains around where you live where the Native American people wrote messages. They knew that you would be there. These were people that looked at the next 7 generations, the next, generations of people. They said, here's where the water is. Here's where the food is. Think about that for a moment. Acknowledge the people of your land of birth. Acknowledge the people of your residency. If we really want to talk about how we can decolonize people, these are simple premises that we can do. There's literally an 800 number that you can text the land. You can text it to them. And I don't have my phone on right now, but I'll send you an email message with the phone number in it. And this is an 800 number that you can text. I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, and it will say the land of the Akmel Atam. It will literally give you the ancestral land. So there's no reason for anybody to not know the ancestral land that they were born on and the ancestral land that they live on. It's a very simple thing that we as people need to take responsibility for. Our children are not going to learn that. It's evident that schools are not teaching this. There's a whole argument that's going on about race theory and all kinds of stuff right now because the way that the educational system has been infiltrated has been to a European colonial ideology. I mean, the daughters of the revolution, or the daughters of the Civil War. You know, these were organizations of people that set up to create a narrative around slavery, around race, around all kinds of stuff that still to this day permeates the zeitgeist of many people living in the United States. It's also infiltrated into other regions of, Americas. And it's important that if we really want to say, hey, I don't want to be a cultural appropriator, I don't want to be a person that is living in the stereotypical mindset of, the Americas. I want to make this a different generation. Then we can integrate very simply, just honoring the land and the ancestral people, and begins by yourself, like really. I mean, my one elder, Ted Begay, he's my uncle, and he would say something like, it's all about you, nephew. How are you going to live your life? Are you going to live a good life? Are you going to live, a life that has, purpose? And empowering the listeners here. Yes, it is hard sometimes to introduce your mom, to introduce your dad, to introduce your grandmas and your grandpas, the lands of their birth. It does hurt. It stings. I'm, the evidence of that. I was fortunate to know my parents, and I was also unfortunate to know my parents. There was issues with that my entire life. So regardless of if you were adopted, if you don't know your parents, if you don't know where your grandparents were from, do your best. Exhaust every opportunity you have to try and find out that about yourself, because it is important. In the back of your mind, there's questions that come forward. And when you do your best to answer those questions about yourself, you hopefully will begin to heal the wounds that a lot of these ideas and concepts of colonialism, fragmented identity, the destructive force of ancestral trauma. When you begin to do the work, you create a lineage. And someday I hope to be sitting in a campfire and my grandson or granddaughter look up from that fire with the flames of that fire radiating in their eyes, and they introduce themselves as me. That's what earth-based communities have known for, like I said, since the dawn of cultural identity. To be in a place where you feel safe and you're by the fire or you're out in the elements and your little child looks up and introduces themselves. I've been fortunate to be in ceremonies where I've seen that happen, where I've seen daughters introduce themselves in the same room as their mothers and introduce themselves as their mothers. What a gift. This is timeless treasures that we as a people that are unraveling the years of trauma of colonialism can begin to experience, and also begin to transform the next 7 generations of a people that understand that, hey, there was people that were here before, that I am of the earth, that I don't necessarily need to look to Mars for the next colonial place to go, that I can start cleaning up my own house, that I can start dreaming awake and integrated world where hopefully, we forget that we were ever dependent on fossil fuels, that we could go to the downtown of any major city and look up and see gardens. How beautiful it would be if we could turn our urban centers into fully automated organic gardens, and then the mono agricultural system could turn back to the wild. I mean, that's what I want to believe. You can look in many different places and you can see all kinds of stories that are being told about the destruction of humanity, about, the destruction of our civilization, that we've lost hope, that the environment is gone, and all of these things. I don't believe any of that. I have a story, and the story is a good news story. We're coming back to the earth. We're coming back to the understanding of the wisdom of this planet. And the more that we do, the more that we heal our ancestral trauma, the more that we heal ourselves, and the more that we live in that place of relationship, relational spirituality. You notice that the conversation, I said, I have a relationship to depression, anxiety. I have a relationship to PTSD. I don't suffer from PTSD. I have a relationship with that part of myself. These are premises within relational spirituality that can be applied to any one of the listeners. They can use it. they can have that in their life. They can have sovereignty and freedom.
Mm. Oh my goodness, Andrew, thank you so much for the blessings that are your words and your stories and your visions. And I just really feel the power of this drumming practice and this reconnection to the earth that it brings for you and for all of our listeners. So I could just ask you question after question and hear more and more of your stories. Our time is winding down, however. So could you please share with the listeners where they might get in touch with you? You have a website. How can they connect with you?
Great. So we're in two places primarily, and that's Drumming Sounds, which is our drum circle facilitation business. And we have a training coming up in, I don't know if this is going to be aired before Thanksgiving, but Thanksgiving weekend, we're doing a training. There's like 3 or 4 spots left in Phoenix, Arizona. But after that, we do drum circle facilitation training, usually 4 times a year. So you can get connected with us, Facebook, Instagram, online, excuse me, Drumming Sounds. And then if you want a copy of the book, it's thesacred7.com. 7 is spelled out. And if you buy a signed copy of the book, I send one into the Arizona Department of Corrections. I did 3.5 years in prison for selling LSD and mushrooms and a small bag of marijuana. It was a very challenging time in my life. I laugh because I think it's like, talk about being a hardcore prisoner. I was never really, I was involved in a lot of violence as a kid because the place I grew up was violent, but I was never really, a violent individual. But I ended up going to prison for, basically the medicine that I believe helped me.
Mm.
If it was several hundred years ago, I think a person like myself would have been, doing ceremony with plant medicines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, fortunately for me, I was given an opportunity to use these substances, and I do believe that they helped me. I'm not an advocate. I'm not saying go out and go and do a psychedelic experience and you're going to bam, be healed. I was a guy mumbling to myself after some of these experiences for years. But thankfully, I put my life back together and I live a really blessed life,
Mm.
a life that I never thought would ever be possible. 20 years plus free from heroin addiction, 20 years plus free from cocaine
Mm.
addiction, and I'm with the woman of my dreams,
Mm.
Monica, and we just travel around making music, having a beautiful time, and sharing with people like your audience. Thank you all so much for getting connected with me again. It's Drumming Sounds and Sacred 7, thesacred7.com. Get a free copy of the book or get a signed copy of the book. Signed copy gives me ability to send one into the Arizona Department of Corrections, and you get a personalized message, but everybody can get a PDF copy for free and begin to implement these strategies of self-identity and ancestral healing into your life.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I highly encourage folks to go ahead and get a copy of that book one way or the other. I've gotten one myself, and really appreciate what I'm learning there. And thank you so much for sharing with me, sort of coaching me through the introduction process. What a blessing. And
Oh,
listen,
and I offer that too. Also, if somebody wants coaching with ancestral ceremonial introduction, I do have some coaching products that are available. There's an online class there too,
awesome.
that you can get. Sometimes I forget all that stuff.
Yeah, well, we can go and explore your online spaces and find out more about all the things
Very
you
cool.
offer. And yeah, I really appreciate it. And listeners also know that if you want to learn more about what's going on in the Womb-Centered Healing Temple, which is the organization through which this podcast is coming towards you, please feel free to go to wombcenteredhealing.com and sign up for the mailing list, and also keep an eye out for announcements about the other podcasts in this Ancestral Healing series. All right, thank you so much. Are there any last words of blessing or wisdom that you'd like to offer, Andrew?
I just want to just encourage everybody, things are getting better. I really believe that. So I know there's many of us suffering with depression, anxiety, and all these feelings out there. Yet change your story, change your world. Believe that the good thing is coming. And if you need some help, reach out. I'm here for people, even if it's on Facebook. Send me a message. You need some prayers, I'll drop you a 1 minute prayer. Just reach out.
Mm, mhm. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right, that's all for now. Until next time, take good care.